Chapter 2, Production Possibility Curves. In this video, we're going to talk about whether trade is advantageous and what the advantages are to trading. So, where did gains from trade come from? And the first advantage we're going to talk about is absolute advantage. This is the ability for a producer to make a good using fewer inputs than another producer. So, if one producer can make it with less labor hours or less technology and equipment or less acreage of land, then they would have the absolute advantage. Now, if you have two producers with the same amount of labor hours and inputs, and one of them can make more outputs with the same amount of inputs, they would also have the absolute advantage here. So if you look at the example that we did in class with the US and Japan, which country had an absolute advantage in wheat and which country had an absolute advantage in computers? Go ahead and write that down. All right, so for the first question, which country had an absolute advantage in wheat? You should have said the United States. If you remember, when we did these problems a couple of videos ago, it only took the US 10 hours to make wheat, and it took Japan 25 hours. So it takes them longer to make a ton of wheat. So, which country has the absolute advantage in computers then? Now, this might have seemed like a trick question. The answer is not Japan. The answer here is the United States. So, again, it took the United States 100 hours to make one computer, and it took Japan 125 hours. So, the US has an absolute advantage over Japan in both of these particular products, wheat and computers. So, why is there an advantage for us to trade with Japan? Partially because trade is not based on absolute advantage. Trade is based on comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than the other producer. Remember, opportunity cost is what you're giving up. So that means you're giving up less of the other good when you make something. So if you are going to make one wheat, who gives up the smaller amount of computers when they make wheat? So if you look back at your examples, figure out who has a comparative advantage in wheat and also in computers. So you'll notice that the United States has a comparative advantage in wheat because every time we make 1 ton of wheat, we give up less computers. And for your second question, who has a comparative advantage in computers? In this case, it's Japan, because every time Japan makes one computer, they give up less wheat. I'll show you how we get this. This is a comparative advantage chart. What I did is I took the maximum numbers from the US's graph, which was 5,000 wheat and 500 computers, and I whittled it down to a ratio. It's a 1-to-10 ratio. In this case, for the US, every time they make one computer, they have to give up 10 tons of wheat. That means that alternatively, when the US makes one wheat, they give up 1/10 of a computer. This is just the reciprocal. So Japan had a maximum of 1,200 wheat and 240 computers. If I whittle that ratio down, it's 1 computer to 5 wheat. And that means for Japan, 1 wheat will equal the reciprocal, which is 1/5 computers. Now, if I want to know who has the comparative advantage in computers, I look at this chart. When we make one computer, we have to give up 10 tons of wheat, and they only have to give up 5. Our cost, our opportunity cost is higher. In fact, it's twice as high. They only have to give up 5 tons of wheat. So their opportunity cost is lower, which is why they have a comparative advantage in the first product, which is computers. For wheat, when we make 1 ton of wheat, we give up 1/10 of a computer. They'd have to give up 1/5. 1/10 is a smaller number. So we have a lower opportunity cost, which is why we are making the wheat and have a comparative advantage in wheat. If you work out these numbers and both of your producers have a comparative advantage in one thing, for the most part, a trade will work. There are some situations in which both of the comparative advantages are equal, or one producer is so small they really can't make the total amount for it to be advantageous to trade. But for the most part, two comparative advantages are going to equal a trade that would be useful to both countries. Now, why is this important? because countries can specialize in things. So, in this particular example, the US is a pretty big producer. We can make a lot of wheat pretty quickly and efficiently. We can also make a lot of computers quickly and efficiently. But it's not worth our time to make things just because we can. If we are so good at making wheat, in fact, we are 10 times better at making wheat than computers, then we should focus on what we're good at. Those are our skills, and that is our advantage. And if we focus on that and we make a lot of extra, we can then trade the extra for things we're less good at. In this case, computers. But it can also be all sorts of other things. The US could make all of its t shirts and toys and other things, but we don't because we have a lot of trade partners who can do that. And we can spend our time making things that other countries can't. This is how the world economic pie gets larger. The goal of capitalism is not to make your slice of the pie larger at somebody else's expense, to make their slice smaller. The goal is to grow the entire size of the pie so everybody's slice is larger.